There is a list of places in the UK that are allowed to call themselves cities, and everywhere else has to make do with town, village, power station, wall, or such like. Everyone here is kind of aware of that fact, and it's also obvious that what gets put on the list is kind of counterintuitive. Salford and Manchester are both cities, despite the fact that Salford is in Manchester. Westminster and the City of London are both cities, despite the fact that the city they're both part of, London, isn't one. Cities like Ripon or Wells are the size of small towns and are essentially commuter belt for their much larger neighbours, while places like Reading or Northampton, which are big and act as the major urban centre for quite large parts of the country, are mere towns. At least they were when I wrote this script. This list of cities gets a bit longer every few years when someone with a naff hat crayons in a batch of new ones. The last time this happened was in 2022, when first Southend, then Wrexham, Milton Keynes, Bangor, the one in Ireland, Dunfermline, Doncaster and Colchester gained the ability to call themselves cities, maybe 5 extra tourists a year, and no other benefits or privileges. Let's see why these were chosen and the other candidates that year weren't. Yeah, no, it's completely arbitrary. Purely ceremonial title means nothing. If you go back to before the 19th century, though, it starts looking like there's a pattern. All these places have cathedrals. As new cathedrals are established, or rather new Church of England dioceses, but I won't go into that, you'd expect these places to become cities, and so they do. Ripon and Manchester and St Albans and Truro and Liverpool and Newcastle, and then the pattern just falls apart as places like Southwell in Nottinghamshire and Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk gain cathedrals but remain towns. Hang on a second, let's go back to the pre-Victorian list. Bath is on there, hasn't got a cathedral. Westminster hasn't got a cathedral, or at least didn't at the time. Sure, they've got buildings that look like cathedrals, Bath Abbey and Westminster Abbey, but that doesn't mean anything. Lots of places have big fancy medieval churches. What about Christchurch Priory or Beverley Minster? No one would bat an eyelid if you told them something that looks like that was a cathedral, but Christchurch and Beverley have never been cities. But look, it's the 21st century. No one cares about cathedrals anymore. A city is a place where lots and lots of people live. Sure, these old historic places can keep calling themselves cities if they want. Salisbury's 40,000 inhabitants or Armagh's 16,000 might have been a lot 500 years ago, but if somewhere new wants to start calling itself a city, it probably should have more than that. Let's say 100,000 as a cut-off point. Incidentally, of the 7 new 2022 cities, none of Bangor, Doncaster proper, Dunfermline or Wrexham meet it. Here are some of the many towns in the UK with more than 100,000 inhabitants. As you can see, all of them are in England. This is pretty much to be expected, as by far the majority of the UK's population live in England. And in fact, the concept of a city was essentially imported from England into Scotland, Wales and Ireland. But already of the UK's 76 cities, 55 are in England. And it seems unfair to the Scots, the Welsh and the inhabitants of the 6 counties to skew that ratio even further. Another potentially dubious consequence of going with the population limit definition can be seen in the case of the Mersey Valley in the northwest. As it stands, this area has 3 cities, Liverpool, Manchester and Salford. To an outsider, it's fairly obvious that number should be 2. You can clearly see from above that there's 2 big blobs that kind of peter out at the edges. And we'll have no doubt that St Helens, Wigan, Warrington, Bolton, Stockport and Rochdale all have their own independent identities. They must gravitate towards Liverpool and Manchester at least to a certain extent. They're not really the main urban centres in their area. Having a population cut-off point also means that places could very easily move in and out of city status depending on what counts as part of the settlement. Those definitions are constantly being changed, and there's rarely ever a consensus as to what's just a suburb and what's actually a neighbouring town that happens not to have a gap in between. No longer would there be a definitive list of cities to memorise and do Sporkle quizzes about. No longer would the title have as much weight to it. So I don't think that's the solution. It feels like population has to play some part, but a more subtle one. A new city should at least be decently big, more than a couple of thousand inhabitants at least, but it should also be the major urban centre for its region. I don't know how you'd come up with a consistent scientific way of measuring that, so I'm afraid that at this point it all comes down to vibes and whim. I also actually kind of like the has a cathedral thing factoring in somehow, although I probably wouldn't apply it rigidly. City status is basically a tourism thing anyway, and I'd imagine that the sort of tourists who go to a B-list city are going to want to see its cathedral, or at the very least something impressive and historical. Plus, it adds a little bit of fun chaos to the mix, along the lines of, what? This tiny place is a city? What were they thinking? You know, fun for weeks, never gets old. So anyway, if I was given the NAF hat, these are the places that I would make cities before giving several places independence, abolishing daylight savings, mucking about trying to single-handedly fix the damage caused by centuries of imperialism and capitalism, and abolishing the monarchy. Rochester in Kent is a no-brainer. It had been a city since medieval times, but was accidentally removed from the list in 1998. They only noticed 4 years later, but for some reason the Queen has refused to put it back ever since. Sure, today it's one of only 5-ish similar-sized towns that have all merged together. Sure, there's no governing body for just Rochester to turn into a city council. Not that that's a requirement. The whole situation's just an interesting historical wrinkle that gets me annoyed in a fun way. Elgin, in northeast Scotland, is a similar story. Recognised as a city for hundreds of years, continues to style itself as a city in its local government and football team, had a big fancy cathedral, now in ruins, but for some reason it was never officially put on the list. At 25,000 it's not massive, but it is the biggest town between Aberdeen and Inverness. Brechin, northeast of Dundee, is much smaller but also styles itself as a city in the same ways, and its cathedral is still standing. Blackburn is quite big at 120,000, it has a cathedral and is the centre of an Anglican diocese. In the centre of Lancashire it's far enough away from Manchester to be comfortably out of its orbit, and while not far from the city of Preston, the two are similarly sized and it doesn't look like one dominates the other. Northampton and Middlesbrough are both at the centre of significant urban areas, 250,000 and 380,000 respectively. They're decently far from other cities, and they do have cathedrals, Catholic ones far from the town centre, but they absolutely count. In the end, there were only 4 or 5 towns I would include purely for their size. Ipswich is by far the biggest town in Suffolk at around 150,000, and has been quite big and important since medieval times. Before Colchester was added in 2022, it was in the middle of a big cityless void, and even with Colchester around it, has a sizable hinterland. Same story for Reading and Swindon, populations both in the upper 100,000s, main town for large parts of the country. Bournemouth and Poole have merged with each other about 100 years ago, and it's difficult to know which one should become the city. Their shared urban area has well over 400,000 inhabitants, and they contribute around about the same population as each other. Bournemouth's bigger and has a university, while Poole has a more picturesque town centre and a historically very important harbour. Include either or both. I'm going to say both for now, but you can pretend I picked the one you like more. Now we're on to smaller towns with cathedrals. Given that it was pretty much basically the definition of a city in the UK before Victorian times, I will say that by default, places with a Church of England cathedral should be called cities. Besides what we've covered, that includes Guildford, Southwark, Bury St Edmunds and Southwell. I'm just going to discount Southwark straight away because look, that's just London. London doesn't need to be 3 cities, but the rest are going on the list. Guildford is not actually small at just under 100,000 or just over depending on who you ask. Bury St Edmunds has about half that. Southwell has only 7,500 residents. At the end of the 19th century it pretty much consisted of 2 roads. But look, it's not a suburb of anything, it's included. In terms of Catholic cathedrals, besides the places already covered, there's one in Shrewsbury, Brentwood, Arundel and Aldershot. The cathedral in Aldershot is not actually the cathedral of Aldershot, but the cathedral of something called the Bishopric of the Forces. There is no Diocese of Aldershot. Because that doesn't really count, because I hate the army, and because it's just down the road from Guildford, it's not going on my list. Arundel is a cute little rural Sussex town of 3,500 people. The idea of it as a city appeals to my sense of whimsy, and its cathedral is very impressive. Arendel's location doesn't do it any favours. It's within 2 miles of the 480,000 strong Sussex coast conurbation that stretches from Littlehampton to Brighton, and, as I'm sure you remember, cities should have their own hinterland in my eyes. This is hinterland. Also, this part of England is doing alright for cities. Brentwood, not tiny at 55,000 people, but right next to London, and Essex doesn't need a 4th city. Shrewsbury, though, population 77,000, is in a cityless void, and Shropshire doesn't have a city yet. I went there once, and it felt like a small city rather than a large town. Definitely on the list. It was that or Telford. Also, there's a Coptic cathedral in Stevenage that looks kind of cool, but come on, Stevenage. I'm bored of talking about England, I bet you're bored of listening. So, Wales. Wales is a tricky one because most of the population is in the southeast, which is already doing pretty well for cities, with a fair bit in the far north, which is doing pretty well for cities. The middle bit just doesn't have big towns. When it comes to cathedrals, there's one in every Welsh city, but only one outside the city, in Brecon. At around 8,500, it's not small by mid-Wales standards. It's actually significantly bigger than the Welsh cities of St David's and St Asaph put together. But even with that, there's still a big gap in the middle of Wales. The biggest town in the area, also right near its centre, is Aberystwyth. It's very important for the area. It's got an old university. I know what university is. I went there twice. Couldn't finish it because I was more concerned with vibe and whimsy than academic rigour. Aberystwyth. Moving across the Irish Sea now. In the 6 counties there are 4 cathedrals not in cities. These are in Enniskillen, Clougha, Dromore and Downpatrick. Clougha is a village of 700 people, and not even my whimsy will stretch that far. Dromore has 6,500 inhabitants and is close to Lisburn. Downpatrick and Enniskillen have 12,000 and 14,000 each and are the biggest towns for miles around. Make them cities. Now there's still a fairly large gap in the area between Belfast and Derry, but nothing really jumps out at me. I suppose we can leave it there. Up to Scotland now, and in terms of Church of Scotland cathedrals, we've got none, because the Church of Scotland doesn't have cathedrals, but it did before 1689, so let's list them. What the hell? Dornoch, Dunblane, Dunkeld, Fortrose, Kirkwall, Iona, Lismore, St Andrews, Whithorn. Lismore Cathedral is just in a field. The island of Iona has under 200 inhabitants. Whithorn is a good long distance from any cities, but still well under 1,000 population, so no. Dunkeld is in a beautiful setting at the edge of the Highlands. I stopped there once, but didn't have a look round for some reason. This place apparently sometimes already gets called a city, but it shouldn't even count as a town, look at it. Fortrose's Cathedral is in ruins. That's somewhere I actually have had a look around. It's quite nice. It's also tiny and right next to Inverness. Dornoch looks from above like it should have more than its population of 1,400. Then you zoom in and realise that half the houses are B&Bs. Dornoch is half as big as Tain, just across the Dornoch Firth, but you won't hit a bigger town until you get to Wick, 60 miles to the north. This is remote by British standards. Be quiet at the back. I don't see any one reason not to include it other than that it's smaller than St David's, whose only claim to fame is being Britain's smallest city. Introducing a smaller one would kill St David's just like that, which seems morally wrong to an extent I can't justify. Kirkwall, though. As you drive north from Orkney's ferryport, 150 miles after Inverness, and it gradually appears in the valley to your left, you think, now there's a city. It may be a town of only 10,000, but it dominates that archipelago like you wouldn't believe. St Andrews is really not very far from Dundee, but it remains the main urban centre for a modestly large part of Fife. Its cathedral may be in ruins, but it's hard to miss on any day in the town. It's got a really old university, it manages to be world famous with a population of only 18,000. The only reason not to make it a city would be the smug, condescending look on the faces of the golf-addled representatives as the king handed them their new honours. I'm afraid there's also Anglican and Catholic cathedrals in Scotland, so let's run through those. Oban's got one of each, so that's probably an automatic qualification right there. Then Millport, Ayr, Motherwell and Paisley. Millport, the town of the island of Great Cumbrae, is a bit smaller than St David's, though the idea of a city on such a small island does appeal to me. Motherwell and Paisley both answer to Glasgow, but Ayr stands on its own. With an urban area of 62,000, it's pretty big by Scottish standards. Not somewhere I really know anything about, but it seems like a fairly obvious inclusion. As you'd expect from Scotland, most of the cities are in the central belt, but the Highlands and the North East are fairly well represented. South of the central belt, though, there's quite a gap, with no standout obvious choice. The biggest town by far is Dumfries at 33,000, which actually has applied for city status the last 2 times it was being awarded. I'd probably have stronger feelings on this if I'd actually been there, but that's just the nature of this video. Oh well, I'll give Dumfries the benefit of the doubt for now, but if I had another go at this project I might change my mind. Just one more as a wild card, as if this video wasn't marred enough by self-absorbed sentimentality. The 5 boroughs were the main fortified towns in Danish-occupied Mercia in the late 9th century and early 10th. After the area was recaptured by the English, they all became the capitals of their own county, and as a result are now all decent-sized cities: Lincoln, Nottingham, Derby, Leicester, but not Stamford. If Rutland had only been made a little bit bigger. Nevertheless, Stamford remained an important town throughout the Middle Ages, and for a brief period in the 14th century, it had a university, founded by a group of academics who left Oxford University, apparently over its treatment of its northern members. This was England's 3rd university after Oxford and Cambridge, and had it survived, the town probably would have gone the same way as those two. But it didn't, and Stamford lost its 2nd chance at fame and glory. So yeah, basically I think of it as a charming little underdog, and I'm making it a city now. Alright, so let's see. We started at 76 cities, 55 of them in England, which is 72%. Let's find out how bad my pro-England bias actually is. We're now at 101. Maybe I should have stopped before Stanford to make it a nice 100 and give it an air of completeness and unchangeability like the 50 states of the USA. Hang on. Wait, we are allowed to remove cities from the list as well. It happened to Rochester after all. Well, that settles it. Salford is now part of Manchester and we're back to the unchangeable, inevitable, eternal 100 cities of the UK. Of those 100, 68 of them are in England. The ratio's gone down. I've done it. I am the saviour of the Celtic fringe. All ye shepherds, orangemen, and shepherds may approach and kiss my royal hand once each. So that's the end of the main bit of the video, but I have actually written a postscriptum which I would like to read out to you now. So here it is. One doesn't spend this long thinking about UK cathedrals without becoming used to the idea of the established church, the state church. It becomes background. But the Church of England is an organisation whose head is a king, whose bishops are lords. This is the status quo, the establishment, the power. Goodness knows the power hasn't always been used well. And cathedrals, besides being pretty old buildings, are primarily symbols of that power. By attempting to make the concept of a city as it exists consistent and nice, I reaffirm the idea that its original definition was a good one. I don't just say a historical fact, I say that it's right and proper that a cathedral, symbol of the power of the establishment and the status quo, should be the heart of a city, the thing that defines it. And maybe that's not great in 20s Weimar Britain. The somewhat megalomaniacal tone I take in this video was a conscious choice. Ceremonial and pointless though it may be, the title of city carries great weight in people's minds. The fact that it is bestowed from above, sprinkled onto chosen towns in dribs and drabs at the behest of one person, is absurd. I hope I communicated that there is no objective and no non-patronising way to decide what should and shouldn't count as a city. My list, as fond as I am of it, should under no circumstances be made official. If anything, if city-state isn't to be done away with altogether, it should be for the people who live somewhere to decide collectively what to call it. If the majority of people in Port Talbot want a city for their hometown, who's to tell them it can't be one? Who am I to tell Salford they're just Manchester? The whole thing is silly and unscientific and arbitrary, but it turns out I like those sort of things. I like jumping between yards and metres wantonly, mischievously. I like that they're wapentakes up north and hundreds down south. I like putting a U in colour. I like that Mr. Blobby used to be normal and referencing him still is. I like how Rutland exists. I like saying going into town when I mean the city centre. I like how the Top of the Pops repeats are shown on the important Sirius channel. I like it when a cold, leaky concrete cube from the 60s is squeezed between a half-timbered Tudor pub, equally leaky, and something stern and Victorian. I'd never call myself proud to be British, but there's a fair bit of silly, unscientific, arbitrary, centuries-old rubbish here that's just kind of fun.